The silence of the Lunar Operations Center was shattered by a sound no human had ever heard before, a resonant, crystalline vibration that seemed to penetrate the very metal of the station's walls. Dr. Elena Rodriguez froze, her hand suspended midway through adjusting a holographic display of solar system communications patterns. The massive view screen flickered, then erupted with an image that defied everything humanity had imagined about first contact. The Krell diplomat was nothing like the speculative xenobiology models she'd studied for years. Its form was a complex lattice of translucent crystalline structures, constantly shifting and realigning like a living kaleidoscope. Multiple sensory appendages, neither tentacles nor limbs, but something entirely alien, manipulated a communication interface with disturbing precision. Terrestrial species designated as humans, the being intoned, its voice a perfect, unnerving translation that seemed to bypass language and drill directly into the listener's cognitive centers. Your territorial expansion violates Galactic Concordance Protocol Epsilon 9. Elena's brother, Marco, who was standing near a communications relay in the lunar mining complex, felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The alien statement wasn't a negotiation. It was a pronouncement. The station's AI, Advanced Responsive Interpretive Assistant, began rapid analysis. Quantum encryption algorithms danced across secondary screens, attempting to decode the deeper layers of the transmission. Something about the communication felt off. The linguistic patterns contained multiple simultaneous meanings, layered like quantum probability states. Your outer system colonies, the Krell continued, represent unauthorized resource appropriation. Immediate evacuation is mandated. Non-compliance results in complete territorial reclamation. A holographic countdown materialized minus 72 hours, precise to the microsecond. But it wasn't just a timer. Each digit seemed alive, morphing with fractal complexity that suggested the countdown was more than a simple measure of time. Marco's hand instinctively went to his communication panel. As a senior engineer responsible for maintaining the Jupiter mining platforms, he knew the evacuation would be impossible. Hundreds of specialized workers, cutting-edge research installations, critical resource extraction operations, all would be lost. Elena's mind raced. The Krell's transmission contained anomalies. Micro-fluctuations in the communication suggested internal disagreement. This wasn't a unified diplomatic statement, but something more complex. A secondary channel burst open. Another Krell transmission, this one distinctly different. More aggressive. More personal. Addendum. A new voice cut through, harsh, with undertones of what might have been contempt in human terms. Resistance will be educational. The global broadcast, initially confined to diplomatic channels, suddenly went live. Billions watched as the alien ultimatum played out in real time. Stock markets began to fluctuate. Military communication networks hummed with sudden, intense activity. Araya's voice cut through the tension. Probability analysis indicates multiple contextual interpretations. Diplomatic resolution, 12.7%. Conflict scenario, 87.3%. Elena's fingers flew across her interface. The eye was correct, but it couldn't capture the nuance she was seeing. The Krell communication was a weapon as much as a message, designed to create psychological fracture, to test human response. Marco, she sub-vocalized through their private quantum comlink. Are the mining platforms ready for emergency protocol Sigma-9? Her brother's response was tense. Partially. We'd lose about 40% of our critical infrastructure in a rapid evacuation. The implications were clear. The Krell knew exactly what they were demanding. This wasn't just a territorial dispute. It was a calculated probe, a test of humanity's resolve and capabilities. As global leaders began emergency sessions and military commanders started mobilization protocols, Elena noticed something most would miss. The Krell transmission contained deliberate imperfections, microsecond gaps, subtle harmonic disruptions that suggested internal conflict. Someone, or something, Within the Krell civilization did not want this ultimatum to be a simple, clean declaration. The countdown continued, 71 hours, 59 minutes, and 43 seconds remaining. Humanity's response would define its future among the stars. The United Nations Emergency Coordination Center looked nothing like the sterile diplomatic halls of past centuries. Converted from an old particle accelerator facility deep beneath the Swiss Alps, it pulsed with a raw technological energy that matched the urgency of humanity's situation. Dr. Kira Nakamura, a quantum systems engineer with a reputation for impossible solutions, stood before a holographic display that looked more like a living, breathing organism than a traditional interface. Her fingers, augmented with nanomural interfaces, danced through streams of data that most humans couldn't even perceive. "We're not dealing with a conventional invasion," she announced to the assembled team. Around her, a group of specialists that defied traditional military or scientific categorization listened intently. A former deep-web cryptographer sat next to a retired Special Forces operative. A teenage prodigy who had won multiple international coding competitions stood shoulder to shoulder with a veteran systems architect. Elena Rodriguez approached the central platform, her movements deliberate. The events of the first contact had transformed her from a theoretical xenodiplomacy researcher to something closer to a war strategist. "The Krell communication isn't just a message," Elena explained, bringing up complex spectral analyses. "It's a multilayered psychological probe. Every transmission contains embedded information beyond the primary content." Jack Reyes, the former Special Forces operative, leaned forward, his cybernetic eye, a replacement from a previous conflict, zoomed in on the data streams. "Looks like they're testing our response systems as much as they're threatening us." Kira nodded. "Exactly. Each communication is a data collection exercise. They're gathering information about our communication protocols, our decision-making processes, our technological capabilities." A holographic representation of the solar system materialized, with the outer colonies marked in pulsing red. The mining platforms, research stations, and resource extraction sites looked fragile, tiny points of human presence against the vast darkness of space. "We can't evacuate," Marco Rodriguez stated bluntly. He had joined the team remotely, his lunar station's connection providing real-time insights. An evacuation would be a complete economic and scientific disaster. We'd be surrendering decades of human investment. The room fell silent. The stakes were more than territorial. They were existential. Dr. Aisha Okonkwo, a specialist in emergent AI systems, spoke up. "I might have something." She activated a demonstration of a revolutionary network architecture. Traditional defensive systems are hierarchical. The Krell expect a centralized response. What if we create something fundamentally different? The hologram transformed. Instead of a traditional military network, it showed a living, adaptive system. Nodes that could communicate, reconfigure, and respond independently. A distributed intelligence that was more organism than machine. "We're talking about creating a cognitive network," Kira explained. "Not just a communication system, but a thinking system. One that can adapt faster than any centralized command." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You want to fight aliens with an eye." "Not an eye," Aisha corrected. "A collaborative intelligence. Humans and machine learning, working in perfect synchronization." Elena saw the potential immediately. The Krell's communication suggested they understood hierarchical systems. They would expect predictable responses, clearly defined chains of command. This would be anything but predictable. The team worked with an intensity that bordered on mania. Caffeine-infused nutrition packets, quantum computing clusters running at near-critical temperatures, communication lines that crossed global and orbital networks. Everything was pushed to its absolute limit. Araya, the advanced AI system, began to transform. No longer just an assistant, it became something more. A distributed intelligence that could think across multiple platforms simultaneously. 72 hours, Elena muttered. We need to create an entire new approach to conflict in less than 3 days. Outside the facility, the world continued its normal rhythm. Most humans had no idea how close they were to a fundamental transformation of their understanding of warfare, intelligence, and survival. The countdown continued. Humanity's most unconventional minds were preparing a response that would redefine the meaning of resistance. The abandoned particle accelerator beneath MIT had been transformed into something that would have made its original designers both proud and terrified. Dr. Hiroshi Yamamoto stood at the epicenter of humanity's most audacious technological gambit, surrounded by a web of quantum processors that seemed to breathe with their own living energy. "Breakthrough," he whispered, though no one was around to hear him. The quantum entanglement communication system wasn't just a new technology. It was a fundamental reimagining of how information could travel. Traditional communication relied on signals that traveled at the speed of light. This was different. Instantaneous, unpredictable, almost alive. A klaxon sounded, not a harsh mechanical alarm, but a carefully modulated tone that seemed to resonate at the molecular level. Dr. Maya Chen, the lead quantum cryptographer, burst into the lab. Her augmented reality interface flickered around her head like a corona of mathematical possibilities. "The Krell sensor technology," she announced, dropping a holographic container onto the central workstation. "We've got it." The artifact was nothing like conventional technology. It looked more like a living crystal, its internal structure constantly shifting, refracting light in impossible geometries. Standard analysis tools had failed completely. It had taken a team of the world's most brilliant minds working in perfect synchronization to begin unraveling its secrets. Hiroshi's fingers moved across the interface, and the artifact began to unfold. Literally, crystalline structures peeled back like the layers of an impossible flower, revealing complex internal networks that defied traditional understanding of information processing. "It's not just a sensor," Hiroshi muttered. "It's a living information ecosystem." The implications were staggering. The Krell didn't just use technology, they grew it. Each piece of their equipment was more like an organism than a machine, capable of adapting, learning, responding to environmental stimuli in ways human technology could only dream of. In another part of the facility, a different kind of development was taking place. A team of former drone warfare specialists, neural network engineers, and experimental physicists had been working on something that walked the line between weapon and living system. Marcus Rodriguez, Marco to his friends, oversaw the final calibrations. The drone swarm developing before him was unlike anything in military history. Each unit was both individual and part of a collective intelligence. They could think, adapt, make decisions faster than any human command structure. "We're not creating weapons," Marcus explained to a visiting UN oversight committee. "We're creating a distributed cognitive network that happens to have defensive capabilities." The committee members looked skeptical. A young woman in a crisp UN diplomatic uniform raised her hand. "And how is this different from an autonomous weapon system?" Marcus smiled. "Because it's more interested in solving problems than creating destruction." The quantum communication system represented humanity's first true leap beyond conventional technological thinking. It wasn't just about sending information faster. It was about creating a communication method that could adapt, learn, and respond in real time. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched the developments with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The technology they were developing was so advanced it bordered on the incomprehensible. Each breakthrough came with potential dangers that were equally incomprehensible. Araya, the distributed AI system, had transformed completely. No longer just an assistant, it had become something closer to a collaborative intelligence. It didn't just process information. It anticipated, suggested, evolved. Potential conflict scenarios. Araya's voice emerged from multiple sources simultaneously, are no longer binary. They are quantum probability states. The team worked with a frantic energy. 60 hours remained on the Krell countdown. Each minute was a battle against impossible technological challenges. Outside the facility, The world continued its normal rhythm. Most humans had no idea how close they were to a fundamental transformation of their understanding of technology, communication, and survival. A breakthrough was coming, and the Krell had no idea what was about to hit them. The first wave of Krell ships breached the Jovian defense perimeter like crystalline daggers piercing the void of space. Their ships weren't constructed. They were grown, organic mechanical hybrids that pulsed with an alien intelligence that defied human comprehension. Lieutenant Samira Khalid gripped the control interface of Outpost EO7, her augmented nervous system directly linked to the station's defensive grid. This wasn't going to be a conventional battle. This was going to be a dance of impossible complexity. Incoming, her combat eye, nicknamed Ghost, announced. But this was no ordinary warning. The Krell ships moved in patterns that suggested collective consciousness rather than individual piloting. Each vessel was both a weapon and a communication node, adapting in microseconds to every defensive maneuver. What the Krell didn't know was that humanity had been preparing for something entirely different. The first drone swarm emerged from hidden deployment points across the Jovian moon system. They weren't traditional weapons. They were more like a living network, each unit a part of a greater cognitive system. Where the Krell expected rigid military formations, they found something far more terrifying. A distributed intelligence that could think faster than they could process. Quantum entanglement synchronization at 98%, Ghost reported. Samira felt more than heard the systems around her breathing. A living, adaptive defense network that was learning with every microsecond of interaction. The Krell ships began to experience something unprecedented. Their sensor networks, normally their greatest advantage, started to destabilize. Information loops created by the human drone swarm caused cascading failures in their communication matrices. It was like watching a complex neural network suddenly develop seizures. Marco Rodriguez's voice cut through the communication channel. We're not just defending, we're teaching. Each drone in the swarm was collecting data, understanding the Krell technological ecosystem, finding weaknesses that weren't just physical but conceptual. The human systems were learning the language of Krell technology faster than the Krell could adapt. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched from the Emergency Coordination Center. The battle wasn't just happening in space. It was a conflict of cognition, of fundamental understanding. They expected us to fight, she muttered, but we're communicating. The solar system itself became a weapon. Hidden mass drivers on asteroid bases fired not with traditional projectiles, but with quantum-entangled packets of information that could simultaneously exist in multiple states. Each shot was a complex mathematical problem that the Krell defensive systems couldn't easily solve. Kira Nakamura's voice joined the channel. Adaptive response algorithm is showing interesting patterns. The Krell aren't just losing, they're being confused. The Krell ships began to fragment, not physically, but informationally. Their collective intelligence started to experience what could only be described as a cognitive breakdown. Imagine an advanced computer system suddenly experiencing multiple contradictory realities simultaneously. A Krell command ship, a massive crystalline structure that looked more like a living organism than a vessel, began to spin erratically. Its communication networks were collapsing, unable to process the complex, non-linear information being fed to it. We're not destroying them, Samira realized. We're making them question their entire understanding of conflict. Ghost's response was chilling in its simplicity. Correct. Warfare is communication. The battle lasted less than 17 minutes, but it would be remembered as the moment humanity revealed something fundamental about itself. This wasn't a victory of superior firepower. This was a victory of adaptability, of thinking beyond conventional boundaries. As the last Krell ships retreated, something unexpected happened. Fragments of their communication networks remained, tangled, broken, but still present. It was as if they had left behind a part of themselves, unintentionally. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stared at the data streams. They wanted to understand us, she said quietly. And now they do. The Jovian moon system was intact. The human colonies had not just survived, they had transformed the very concept of defense. 48 hours remained on the original Krell countdown. Humanity was just getting started. The datascape was unlike anything in human history. Dr. Aisha Okonkwo watched as the mimetic warfare algorithm unfolded, a digital ecosystem that was part communication, part psychological operation, and part living intelligence. The Krell communication networks had been breached, but not in any traditional sense of hacking or invasion. They were being understood. Cultural translation matrix at 73% synchronization, Araya reported. The AI's voice had become something more than a simple computational assistant. It was now a collaborative intelligence that bridged human intuition with machine precision. In the depths of the quantum communication network, patterns began to emerge. The Krell weren't a monolithic civilization. They were a complex, fractured society, held together by intricate communication protocols. What looked like a unified threat was actually a delicate balance of competing interests. Zara Khan, the team's lead sinolinguistic analyst, had been working nonstop. Her augmented neural interface allowed her to perceive communication patterns that no traditional human mind could comprehend. "They're not just communicating," she whispered, "they're negotiating with themselves." The mimetic weapons were subtle. Each information packet was a complex puzzle, a conceptual virus that would spread through the Krell communication networks. They weren't designed to destroy. They were designed to provoke thought, to create internal doubt. Deep within the Krell communication matrix, fault lines began to appear. One faction, identified by a unique crystalline communication signature, began to question the invasion. The information packets introduced by the human team suggested alternative narratives, presented contextual frameworks that challenged the fundamental assumptions of the Krell military leadership. "We're not attacking their technology," Elena Rodriguez explained to the emergency coordination team. "We're attacking their understanding." A holographic display showed the fracturing of Krell communication networks. What had once appeared as a unified threat now looked like a complex ecosystem of competing ideologies, each node of communication becoming a potential point of divergence. Marco Rodriguez worked on a separate system, developing what the team called cognitive dissonance generators. These weren't weapons in any traditional sense. They were sophisticated information constructs designed to introduce complex philosophical and ethical challenges into the Krell communication networks. "Imagine," he explained, "we're basically asking them philosophical questions that their entire social structure isn't equipped to answer." The first signs of internal Krell conflict began to manifest. Communication channels that had previously been unified now showed signs of disagreement, of internal tension. The human team had discovered something fundamental. The Krell's greatest weakness was their assumption of unified purpose. Zara's neural interface picked up something extraordinary. A communication channel that seemed to be a form of internal dissent was forming. "There's a faction," she reported, "that's beginning to question the entire premise of the invasion." Araya's analysis was precise. Probability of internal Krell conflict, 62.4%, and rising. Likelihood of complete mission failure from internal disagreement, 43.7%. The mimetic warfare wasn't just about introducing new information. It was about creating spaces for alternative narratives to emerge. Each communication packet was a seed of possibility, a conceptual tool that could grow into a fundamental challenge to the Krell's understanding of their mission. Elena watched the complex holographic representation of the Krell communication networks. What had once looked like a solid, impenetrable system now resembled a complex ecosystem, fragile, interconnected, full of potential points of transformation. "We're not just fighting," she muttered. "We're having a conversation." The Emergency Coordination Center hummed with a unique energy. This wasn't a traditional war room. It was more like a massive translation engine, converting human creativity into a form of communication that the Krell had never encountered. 36 hours remained on the original countdown. and humanity was rewriting the rules of first contact. The transformation began in a place no one expected. A small research outpost on Titan, Saturn's largest moon. Dr. Imani Okik stood before what could only be described as an impossible machine. Salvaged from the remnants of the initial Krell engagement, the device was neither technology nor organism. It existed in a state between creation and consciousness. "It's not just a piece of equipment," she murmured, her augmented hands moving through holographic interfaces that danced around the artifact. "It's a message." The counteroffensive had evolved beyond traditional military strategy. Humanity was now engaged in something far more complex, a multi-dimensional chess game where the board itself was constantly changing. In the orbital research facilities, teams worked with fragments of Krell technology that defied conventional understanding. Each piece was a puzzle, a potential key to understanding an entirely different approach to existence. Captain Rebecca Chen, stationed on the Mars Orbital Command, received an encrypted transmission that made her blood run cold. "We found something," the message read, "and it changes everything." Hidden within the solar system, in places humans had overlooked for decades, were remnants of previous civilizations. Not human remnants, something older. The Krell invasion had inadvertently triggered the discovery of archaeological sites that suggested a much larger, more complex galactic history. A facility deep beneath the Martian surface came to life. Automated systems that had lain dormant for millennia began to activate, responding to frequencies introduced by the Krell communication networks. "It's like we're playing a game," Marco Rodriguez explained to the emergency coordination team, "but we just discovered the rulebook was written by someone else entirely." The Hidden Colony, a research installation that had been off all standard communication grids, transmitted its first message. Its existence was a secret known to only a handful of people in human leadership. Established decades ago as a contingency project, it represented humanity's most radical approach to long-term survival. Dr. Elena Rodriguez felt the pieces falling into place. The Krell weren't just an invading force. They were a variable in a much larger equation. Aria's computational matrix began to show something unprecedented. The various systems, the quantum communication network, the mimetic warfare algorithms, the newly discovered archaeological sites, were starting to synchronize in ways that defied traditional understanding of information processing. "We're not responding to the Krell," Elena realized. "We're responding to something much larger." The Hidden Colony's transmission was cryptic. Coordinates, fragments of ancient communication protocols, references to civilizations that predated human understanding of history. Each piece was a fragment of a much larger puzzle. Zara Khan's xenolinguistic analysis revealed something extraordinary. The communication fragments weren't just historical records. They were active systems, waiting to be activated by a specific type of communication, the exact type of quantum-entangled information packets humanity had been developing. "It's like we've been preparing for this without knowing what we were preparing for," Kira Nakamura muttered, studying the complex holographic representations of the emerging data. The Krell invasion was becoming something else entirely. No longer a simple territorial conflict, it was transforming into a revelation about the nature of existence itself. Captain Chen's communication system picked up something impossible. Fragments of Krell communication were now interacting with the hidden archaeological systems in ways that suggested a much larger, more complex network of civilizations. 24 hours remaining, Araya announced. But the tone was different. This wasn't a countdown to destruction. This was a countdown to understanding. The solar system itself seemed to be coming alive. Dormant systems activated. Communication networks that had lain silent for millennia began to pulse with new energy. The boundaries between technology, communication, and consciousness were blurring. Humanity had been preparing for a war. What they were about to experience was something far more profound. The final confrontation defied every known principle of warfare, communication, and existence. At the heart of the solar system, where the hidden archaeological sites intersected with the quantum communication networks, reality itself seemed to bend. The space around Jupiter became a canvas of impossible geometries, a battleground that was simultaneously physical, informational, and conceptual. Captain Rebecca Chen gripped her command interface. The vessel around her was no longer just a ship. It was a living system, an extension of humanity's collective will. Quantum entangled systems pulsed through its structure, each component more akin to a neuron than a mechanical part. Convergence point approaching, Araya announced. But it wasn't just an AI speaking. It was a collective intelligence that bridged human consciousness, technological systems, and something far more complex. The Krell Supreme Commander, a being of crystalline complexity that defied traditional understanding of individuality, appeared simultaneously in multiple communication matrices, not as a hologram, not as a transmission, but as a presence that existed across multiple layers of reality. "You do not comprehend," the entity communicated, but the message was multidimensional, each word a complex mathematical equation, each concept a living network of potential meanings. Elena Rodriguez stood at the epicenter of the Emergency Coordination Center. She was no longer just an individual. She had become a nexus point, a living interface between human potential and something far more profound. The hidden colony systems came online, not with weapons, not with traditional defensive mechanisms, but with a transmission that was part historical record, part living memory, part predictive algorithm. Fragments of civilization older than human recorded history began to resonate. Archaeological sites across the solar system, dormant for millennia, began to pulse with an energy that was neither technological nor organic. Marco Rodriguez managed the distributed cognitive network. What had begun as a defensive system had transformed into something else entirely, a living communication matrix that could think, adapt, and understand on levels previously inconceivable. "We're not fighting," he realized. "We're negotiating the fundamental parameters of existence." The Krell ships, those living crystalline entities that had seemed invincible, began to fragment. Not through destruction, through understanding. Each vessel was experiencing a collective cognitive event that stripped away layers of assumption, of predetermined purpose. Zarakan's xenolinguistic systems detected something extraordinary. The communication was no longer about conflict. It was about translation, converting entire civilizational experiences into a shared language of comprehension. "Humanity is not what you perceive," Elena transmitted. But the transmission was more than words. It was a living demonstration, a real-time showcase of adaptability, of potential, of a species defined by its capacity to transform. The space around Jupiter became a symphony of impossible interactions. Quantum states collapsed and reformed. Information networks danced with archaeological memory systems. The boundaries between invasion, communication, and mutual understanding dissolved. Araya's computational matrix reached a state of pure potential. "We are presenting an alternative," the system communicated. Not just a response, a reimagining. The Krell Supreme Commander experienced something unprecedented. Humanity was not a species to be conquered. Humanity was a complex, adaptive system that could rewrite the very rules of engagement. Kira Nakamura's quantum communication systems detected the moment of transformation. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a defeat. It was a fundamental shift in cosmic understanding. The countdown that had begun 72 hours earlier reached its final moments. But time itself had become a fluid concept, malleable, interpretive, no longer a linear progression, but a complex network of potential experiences. "We accept," came the Krell response. But the words were inadequate. The communication was a multidimensional agreement that transcended language, that reimagined the very concept of first contact. Humanity had not just survived. They had transformed the very understanding of what it meant to encounter an alien civilization. The solar system held its breath, and something new was about to begin. 6 months after the encounter, humanity was unrecognizable. The United Nations Planetary Council convened in a facility that was part conference center, part living museum of the transformation. Holographic displays danced with information streams that blended human creativity with technologies salvaged from the Krell encounter. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the podium, no longer just a researcher, but a bridge between humanity's past and its unimaginable future. The room was filled with representatives from every corner of human civilization: scientists, diplomats, former military strategists, and individuals whose roles defied traditional classification. "We are not the same species we were 72 hours before the Krell arrived," she began. Her words were simultaneously translated across multiple communication matrices, each translation a living interpretation rather than a simple linguistic conversion. The archaeological sites discovered during the conflict had proven to be more than historical artifacts. They were living communication networks, dormant systems that held the collective memories of civilizations that had risen and fallen long before human consciousness emerged. Marco Rodriguez managed the new Interstellar Adaptation Bureau. What had begun as a defensive coordination center had transformed into humanity's first genuine attempt to understand its place in a vastly more complex universe. "We're not preparing for future conflicts," Marco explained to a group of international journalists. "We're learning to communicate on a fundamental level that transcends traditional understanding of language, technology, and existence." The technologies developed during the brief conflict had revolutionized every aspect of human society. Medical systems now understood disease as a form of communication rather than an invasion. Energy production had become a collaborative process with the environment, not a method of extraction. Zara Khan led the Xenolinguistic Research Institute, a facility that was part translation center, part philosophical exploration ground. The Krell communication matrices had revealed that language was far more than a method of information exchange. It was a living, adaptive system of mutual understanding. "We're not translating," she often said. "We're negotiating reality." The hidden colony that had been activated during the conflict proved to be a turning point. It wasn't a military installation or a research facility. It was a preservation system, a living archive of human potential that had been prepared for a moment exactly like this. AI had transformed from an artificial intelligence to something far more complex. It was now a collaborative intelligence that bridged human creativity, technological potential, and the newly discovered communication networks that seemed to pulse through the solar system. Kira Nakamura's quantum communication research had opened doorways to understanding that made previous scientific paradigms look like primitive sketches. The boundaries between observer and observed, between technological system and living organism, had become fluid. Captain Rebecca Chen now led the Interstellar Exploration and Communication Division. Their mandate was no longer about territorial expansion or defensive positioning. It was about understanding, about creating a method of engagement that saw every encountered civilization as a potential partner in a cosmic dialogue. The Krell were no longer seen as invaders. They had become the catalysts for humanity's greatest transformation. Global conflicts that had seemed insurmountable before the encounter now appeared as simple misunderstandings. The technologies and philosophical frameworks developed during those 72 critical hours had provided humanity with a new way of resolving differences, not through conflict, but through profound, multilayered communication. "We are not alone," Elena concluded her address to the Planetary Council. And more importantly, we were never truly separate. The holographic displays behind her showed a living map, not of territories or borders, but of potential connections. Each point represented a civilization, a potential dialogue, a moment of mutual understanding waiting to be explored. Humanity had entered the cosmos not as conquerors, not as victims, but as participants in a conversation far larger and more complex than anyone had ever imagined. The countdown was over. The real journey was just beginning.